and I'm really glad to be here. I appreciate this church and appreciate you guys. Know some of you from my days in this area in Tuscaloosa County. It's been a while since we were at Cottondale. I always reminisce when I come back to Tuscaloosa because when I come down the interstate, and I was thinking about it just a little bit ago. I know you guys don't want me to do this. Just bear with me for like 10 seconds. The Buttermilk Road, you know where Buttermilk Road is? I remember it was a while ago, but Melanie and I, our daughter, who's now 26 and married, and of course out of the house and all that, we had her with us. She was just a few months old, and we got off there at Buttermilk Road and went to meet these folks at Cottondale Church of Christ, and we had no idea who any of them were and if they would like us, if we would, want to be a part of the church. Anyway, they were such a blessing to us, and we enjoyed. Good folks there. Some of you related to some of the people we know at Cottondale. So lots of good memories of being in this area, and I appreciate you guys and Scott and Amy and other folks here. I love and appreciate y'all. This topic, I don't remember how I got this topic. If Scott was mad at me or something when he chose me to talk about why does sin anger God, talking about anger, That's a great topic, though, seriously. It is a challenging one. It's kind of a deep topic. I think there are things here that we need to be thinking about. You're familiar with some of these names I'm going to throw out. Names like Richard Dawkins, The God Delusion, probably his most famous book. Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, Christopher Hitchens. There are other names like that. They're often called the new atheists. It's kind of a movement. It's changed a little bit. Atheism has changed. It's progressed. It's kind of adapted to the times. And they've written a lot of books over the past few years. God is Not Great, Why Religion Poisons Everything, The God Delusion by Dawkins and all that. So Dawkins and Harris and all these guys are pretty well known for saying stuff like, this God you serve, this Judeo-Christian God that you serve, he's just this petulant, angry being up there in the sky somewhere who hurls down these lightning bolts when he gets angry, when he loses his cool, he loses his temper, and he just does bad things. He's like a kid that can't control his anger. That's how they characterize God, Dawkins and Harris in particular, Talking about God is just this angry God who is hard to please. You don't know when you're going to set him off. And so I think there's a sense in which this question that we're talking about tonight, talking about God's anger, talking about what it looks like and what it means, is pretty important at this cultural moment because, I spent some time here on this campus when I lived in Cottondale and graduate school here, and I know it's changed a lot since then, but it's probably even progressed more in this direction of certain modes of thought that aren't consistent with what we believe as Christians, So I know you guys are dealing with this. This is one of the arguments that folks are making against the God you and I believe in. So let's think about it tonight. I want to start by we're going to skip around a lot. There's no single passage that we can really take that'll address all the things we need to talk about. So I want to start at the end of the Gospels. I'm going to focus on Matthew just for a minute. We'll skip around, but I want to mention 2 or 3 passages here in Matthew 26. This is Thursday night, the night before Jesus died. You remember the movie, the Mel Gibson movie? This is a long time ago, The Passion of the Christ. Some of you have seen it, I'm guessing. Pretty well done movie, I thought. There were things here and there that we would disagree with, but allowing some poetic license in, it was a pretty good rendering of what a scourging crucifixion would have been like. Pretty gruesome, pretty vivid in kind of walking us through the last few hours of the Lord's life. At the beginning of the movie, if you guys saw it, if you haven't seen it, I don't know, maybe you have an aversion to this sort of thing, and that's fine, but if you have an interest in seeing this on the screen in a pretty memorable, vivid way, I'd encourage you to go back and watch it. At the beginning of the movie, it starts, if I remember right, and you hear Jesus before you see him. It's the Garden of Gethsemane, it's Thursday night, and you hear the sound of heavy breathing, of weeping, of panting, these sounds that are coming through, and there's this image there where the camera zooms in on a snake that's slithering through the garden, and then you see Jesus, and he's bent over, and he's sweating, and he's crying, and he's breathing really hard. He's obviously in great distress. At the climactic moment of that opening scene, Jesus stands up and he stomps his foot on the head of the serpent. And I think it's a pretty good way of bringing the Genesis 3 story into this with the serpent there in the Garden of Eden. That night, though, that Thursday night is incredible to think about. I don't think we can fully grasp what was going on when Jesus was in the garden and he takes the 11 apostles in with him. Then he takes Peter, James, and John and goes a little bit farther into the garden. Then he separates himself from them. He says about as far as you can throw a rock, And then he starts praying. And you combine the different accounts, lots of stuff's happening. Jesus is praying desperately. Matthew 26, verse 39, 42, 44, Jesus prays something like this over and over again. He says, "Oh, my Father, if it's possible," remember this? "Let this cup pass from me." Luke tells us that his sweat was falling off of his body, and it was as if it were great drops of blood, leading some interpreters to think that maybe there was some rare medical condition going on where the capillaries burst into the sweat glands, and from your pores can come sweat mingled with blood. Maybe that's what was going on, but it does indicate he's experiencing something we can't even fathom. In fact, he uses some strong language. I don't know if you've noticed this, but he uses some language like, he says, "My soul is sorrowful, even unto death." And it's pretty emphatic. In fact, the language suggests that Jesus he actually seems to be concerned that he might not make it to the cross. He might not make it out of the garden. He's going to die there. He feels, I think you can modernize this a little bit and say, Jesus is saying, "I'm afraid. Pray for me, guys. Pray for me because I'm afraid I'm about to die. I'm afraid I'm going to die here." So you got the sweat, you got the blood, you got the desperate cry. Hebrews tells us that he's weeping. And you got all this stuff, and Jesus, the Son of God, God incarnate, God as a man. You've got his crying out and saying these things like, "Why? Let this cup pass from me. I can't deal with this." Now, I want you to think with me just for a second, because I'm gonna circle back to this. I want to kind of just throw that out there, lay that down, and we're going to walk somewhere else, and we're going to come back and pick this up again here in a minute. But when he says, "Oh, my Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me," it's interesting that in John's account, when he's finally arrested, when they come to arrest him that night, and Peter draws a sword, and they got that whole deal, that Jesus chastises Peter for doing that. And he says, "Am I not to drink the cup that my Father has given me?" So a few minutes earlier, he's saying, "Oh, my Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me." And then once it's settled, it seems, and they're come to arrest him, Jesus says, "Peter, put your sword aside. I am going to drink this cup." Now, the cup has a lot of significance for our topic. Because in Revelation 14 and verse 10, when John is getting a glimpse of another world, as it were, he uses this expression, "the cup of God's wrath." You can look at this. You can look in Isaiah 54. You can look in some other texts in the Old Testament that when it talks about the cup with reference to God, it is usually talking about the cup of God's wrath. It's talking about the cup of God's wrath. So I think there's a hint here when Jesus is in the garden and he's saying, "Oh, my Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me." And then a few minutes later he says, "I'm going to drink this cup." And then Revelation 14 says it's the cup of God's wrath. And Isaiah 54 says it's the cup of God's fury. That we're supposed to read that with this idea that something is happening there in the Garden of Gethsemane. You got blood, you got sweat, you got tears, you got Jesus offering this desperate cry, that there's a connection there to the wrath of God in some sense, that Jesus is beginning to feel that. Okay, now let's lay that down and come back to it in a few minutes. And I want us to go back, if you would, to the very beginning, almost to the very beginning. And I'd like to go back to Genesis chapter 3, because when we're answering this question, and we're going to, dance around the edges of this. I'm not pretending that we can come to some sort of definitive answer in a few minutes tonight, that this will settle all your questions about it. But I do want to give you some things to think about, because I think there are things that we can know, and it'll help us to think about the wrath of God. And that caricature painted by Richard Dawkins and others is inaccurate, and I want to show you why that is the case. So you got Genesis chapter 1 and 2, of course, everything is good. God created and everything, it was good, it was good, it was good. And then we come to chapter 3. And what happens in chapter 3, you know the story well. As God tells us this story, you've got Adam and Eve there. You've got this relationship with God that is unfettered. There are no obstructions to it. It seems as if they walk and talk with God in the garden. It's just this beautiful Edenic paradise where they had this intimate relationship with God. And then the serpent comes to Eve and he says, you know what, God's just He's trying to keep you from enjoying the world as you ought to enjoy it. He's trying to keep you from seeing the world as it is. Just eat the fruit, eat the fruit. Well, Eve eats the fruit and gives it to Adam who's with her, and he eats the fruit as well, and their eyes are indeed opened. Now, what happens there? God created us. I want to back up one chapter to Genesis 2. God created us to be you've heard the expression image bearers, to be the ones in whom God puts His image. In Genesis 1, verse 27, it says, verse 26, let us make man in our image. Let him have dominion over the fish of the sea. So verse 27, God created man in His own image. In the image of God, He created him, male and female. He created them, and He put them in charge of the garden. He said, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. It's this image being painted of Adam and Eve being the image bearers, the representatives of God in the ancient Near Eastern world, in which this story would have circulated early on, this true story about the way God created everything. In that world, they would have understood it like this. When a king conquered a land, what he would do is he would set up images in various places, images of himself, images of the king. So there'd be a statue here, and there would be a statue there, and another one there. Throughout the land, there would be these various statues. And on those statues would be the image of the king who was in charge, right? And so if you ever wondered, who is the king of the land? All you needed to do is look at the statue and look at the image. So it's the same kind of language in Genesis 1 and 2, and it's talking about God creating us. That He says, the text says that God created us in His image. And then He says, and you go around and you subdue. And so we are to be God's, the word that's often used here is, we're to be God's vice regents. We are reigning with God. That's what Adam and Eve were created to do, to reign over the land. They were to be walking around bearing the image of the king of the land, the creator of the world. Okay? What happened in Genesis 3? Stay with me. What happened in Genesis 3 when they ate the fruit is that all got messed up. And the image of God in Adam and Eve and every one of their descendants, with the exception of Christ, who lived perfectly. But with Adam and Eve and every one of the descendants, the image of God has become distorted. It's become marred. You ever looked at your image in a broken mirror or in a pond that's rippling? You've tried to get a glimpse into what you look like, and it's distorted, it's marred, it's imperfect. That's the idea that happens in Genesis 3. And you read the text there, and several things happen. You've got this vertical severance, this vertical problem between us and God. And so God removes them from the Garden of Eden. They can no longer, in their marred state, be in the presence of God. So you've got this vertical discontinuity, okay? And then you've got horizontal discontinuity, opposition here. Your desire will be for your husband. He will rule over you. There's this conflict between not only man and woman, but between men and men, between women and women, between all people. In Genesis 4, Cain killed his brother Abel, showing us what it looks like. So you've got the horizontal opposition. Okay, so vertical, we're at war with God. And because we're at war with God, we're at war with one another, conflict in the world since that day. And then there's also this distortion that finds its way into the cosmos itself. And so Adam, the earth is going to produce thorns and thistles. You're going to have to, it's not going to willingly produce its fruit. And so you've got this geological kind of conflict as well. The earth itself is distorted. And so we have hurricanes and tornadoes and coronaviruses that go rogue. We have all these consequences of the fall in the world. It's messed up. It's marred. The image of God that's supposed to be reflected in us is messed up. The world itself is groaning. Paul tells us in Romans 8, it's groaning because it itself also is distorted. It's not reflecting what God created it to reflect. So if you go through the biblical story from Genesis on all the way to Revelation, what you see there is God's desire to restore what was there at the beginning, and that is perfect harmony in the world and between us and Him. A good way of talking about the biblical story from Genesis to Revelation is it is God's attempt to undo what happened in Genesis 3 and to restore this perfect harmony in the world of this perfect intimacy, not only between people, God's creation, but between us and Him, and also in the world itself that functions as it was created to function. So, you see, just walk with me for a minute. And I'm getting to this anger idea, but I want you to see why it says God gets angry. And that is all over the place. But you go forward just a few chapters. You see Cain and Abel and murder, and I think we're supposed to read that as that's what happened when we get to be our own gods. We start killing each other. Genesis 6, 7, 8, and 9, the whole world has become violent. That's what happens when we become our own gods. God sends the destructive flood in 6 through 9, you know. And then after that, Noah comes off the ark. It's like a fresh start, and Noah gets drunk. And you've got the thing with one of his sons that happens there. It's an ugly scene. And so the second start isn't much better than the first start. Adam and Eve messed up. Well, Noah has messed up as well. And then you got God calling Abraham in Genesis 12, and God says, I'm gonna bless the world through you. And so you see these steps going through this biblical narrative about God calling Abraham, and through Abraham, God is going to bring about this reconciliation, this restoration of what ought to be Abraham's son Isaac, Isaac's son Jacob. But again and again, we see Abraham, lying about his wife Sarah in Genesis 12. You see Isaac doing something very similar. You see Jacob being a deceitful person. So in every stage of this process, what you've got is this imperfection, this again and again, we fall short of being what God created us to be. Now, here's the point I'm getting at. God keeps working. He keeps working to bring us back to Himself. Skipping a lot of history, but Israel ends up in Egypt. They are slaves there. God sends Moses down to Egypt to rescue them. But prior to that, in fact, the call itself, God appears to Moses in the burning bush. Remember that story? The burning bush, Moses turns aside and to see what's going on. God speaks to him and He says, take your shoes off because you're standing on holy ground. You see what happens? God is perfectly holy, and because of the fall, we are unholy. We're messed up. God is perfect, and because of God's infinite perfection, He cannot be in the same space as us. We cannot be in God's holy space because we are sinful. We're messed up. So God says, take your shoes off, take your sandals off, Moses. You're standing on holy ground. The whole story from Exodus on is God making these attempts to be with us, but they're always mitigated. I mean, in a way, it's like our presence right now is mitigated. Some of you have face coverings on, and there's this social distancing going on. We can, in a sense, I know you feel this. I think you feel this. There's a sense in which we are together, but we're not really together, not the way we want to be together. We got to stay apart. There's this sense in which there was this distancing going on throughout the biblical story. As God establishes the tabernacle, well, even prior to that, God descended on top of the mountain. But you remember what He told the people? Don't you come to the mountain. Don't you come too close to the mountain because you'll die. And then when the tabernacle was built, you have God dwelling in the tabernacle. But you remember what would happen if you went into the temple if you were not a priest? What would happen if you went into the inner sanctum of the temple if you were not the high priest on the Day of Atonement? You remember this? You cannot come into the presence of a holy God in your sinfulness. And so as the story keeps going, God is helping us to see that we, in our brokenness, cannot come into the presence of a holy and perfect God. So I want to pause here and show you how this relates to my topic tonight. Why does sin anger God? It is because sin is that thing in us that separates us from Him. Don't listen to Dawkins when he says it is this angry God flying off the handle, losing his temper, and just kind of indiscriminately pouring out punishments on somebody because he got mad about something. He's a self-centered, petulant kind of God. It's not that at all. But rather, if you follow this biblical story, what it is that God is, and I wish we had a different word besides anger, because anger is such an emotional word for us. Some scholars like to use the English word wrath here. I don't know if that's any better, but if it's better for you, then maybe we can use the word wrath. If wrath can help take some of the emotion out of it. I like the definition. I've seen this in different places. Most recently, I saw it from a guy named Tim Keller, and he defines the wrath of God as, listen closely, I'm going to go back and unpack this a little bit, but the wrath of God as the settled, judicial opposition to all evil and injustice. The settled, judicial opposition to all things evil, to all that is evil and unjust. And I think that's a good definition. If you follow this through the Bible and you look at all the times that it talks about the wrath of God or the anger of God, that you'll see that we sometimes try to take our anger, and my anger and your anger are imperfect, even on our best days. There are days in which we might somewhat reflect the anger of God when we are angry, righteously indignant at something that's hurting one of our children. I think the father-child image, the mother-child image is a pretty good one here. It's probably the best we've got. Maybe that's why when Jesus in John 21, he says, am I not supposed to drink the cup of my Father? That he is helping us to see that the anger in the cup comes from a loving Father. And so maybe the best illustration is, for those of us who are moms and dads and grandparents, that when, if I may use a personal illustration, with my children, especially, well, even now, but maybe especially when they were still home, when I do this right, which I rarely do, but when I see the thing that hurts them, and I see the practice, the working of Satan, I see something getting in their hearts that puts distance between us and helps me to see that our relationship is not what it could be if this thing weren't there. When I feel this righteous indignation toward that thing, not toward my child, whom I love dearly, but I hate the thing that's hurting them. That's approximating, in an imperfect way, the anger of God. The settled, I like the word settled because it's not God is just sitting there and he's calm. You know, I as a dad, there were times where I was, grumpy. I get home and I'm, tired or whatever. And you ever been like this? Am I the only one? Something can set me off just quickly. One of my kids, I come home, especially when all four of them were little, and you come home, you want a little bit of a respite, and they're all over you and all that, chaos, and you're like, would you stop it? Just be quiet for a minute. That sort of thing. I like this definition because the settled, it is not an intemperate thing. It's not God losing his cool. It's a settled. It's a determined. It's a decisive thing. It's because of God's nature. He is holy and he is love and he is perfect. And because of that, his love manifests itself toward the thing that hurts us and separates us from him. And that is what the Bible calls wrath or anger. So it's settled. It is also like the word judicial, because that again takes some of the emotion out of it. It is because of the nature of the relationship between God and us, because of who he is. God is never defined by anger. There are these primary attributes of God. God is love, 1 John 4:8. God is merciful. God is holy. God is just. The Bible does not say that God is anger. it is not a primary attribute of God. It's a secondary quality that flows out of His love. Now, I say all that because I want you to see, why does sin anger God? It is because it is that thing in us that creates distance between us and Him. So, you go through that biblical story and you've got God's presence with the temple and the tabernacle and the temple, and there's always distance there. You may remember they had to stay away from the tabernacle, away from the holy place. They had to camp a certain distance around the tabernacle. There was, wherever God's holiness is, there is distance. And God hates that thing. So if I can make this personal to you guys, when you sin against God, God does not hate you. God is not opposed to you. He's not angry at you as a person. But God's love leads Him to be in this position of settled judicial opposition to that thing that's evil and that thing that is unjust, because it creates distance between you and Him. See, it depends on the way you read the biblical story, and I think the best way to read the biblical story from Genesis 1 to Revelation 22 is God wants to be with us, and I can't even fathom that. Why would a holy, infinite, omnibenevolent, omnipresent God create us to be in His presence? And the only answer to that, I think biblically, is because of love. God created us so that we could experience His love and be in perfect intimacy with Him. And Genesis 3 messed that up. And as a result of that, God's judicial, settled disposition toward the evil and unjust is called anger. And God acts consistently with His love for us in sometimes removing that, and sometimes as a result of that, Hebrews 12 talks about this, God disciplines us out of His anger, not at us, but because the thing that hurts us, so that God may bring us into fellowship with Him. Now I want to come back to what we dropped off a little bit ago. And that is with Jesus, because I think this is where we get the best idea of it, and how I think we ought to frame this question. If you're thinking about, why is God angry, and what does that mean to us, and how do we see this portrayed, I think we got to start and end at this place. So let's go back to Jesus again. Oh, my Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. A few minutes later, He said, am I not to drink the cup that my Father has given me to drink? So He's settled in His mind. He's going to drink the cup. What is the cup? We'll look at that more closely in a minute. But we follow Jesus that night, that Thursday night. Of course, He's taken to Annas and Caiaphas. Through the night, He's mistreated. He's treated horribly. And the next morning, probably around 6 a.m. or so, they take Him to Pilate and sent over to Herod for a while and back to Pilate, ultimately where the decision to execute Him is passed down. And Jesus is beaten. He's scourged, which would have been a merciless experience at the hands of these Roman soldiers. Jesus went through all of that. And then they take Him and He carries part of the cross, apparently part of the way to the place of execution. They compel someone to carry it the rest of the way. Jesus goes there, and the crucifixion experience begins at around 9 o'clock on that Friday morning. Now, you just think about it. You guys know this story. I know we've heard it so many times, but I want you to think about some of the things that happen there. You got 7 sayings on the cross, but some of the phenomenal kind of things that happen when Jesus is hanging on the cross. Remember, there's this moment when the eclipse happens. Remember that? Sun will not shine. There's darkness over the face of the land. And that, biblically speaking, when the sun won't shine, that reflects an act of judgment. You go back to the book of Exodus, and you see that one of the plagues, in fact, the last plague, before the last plague, the 9th plague, there's darkness over the face of the land, signifying God's act of judgment over the land of Egypt. So Jesus is hanging there on the cross, and suddenly it goes black. The earth quakes beneath their feet. There's an earthquake. So you've got this phenomenon, or these phenomena, but beneath Jesus, the earth is expressing violently its opposition. The sun is saying, I will not shine on this event. And it was at that time that Jesus cried out, not Father, but my God, why have you forsaken me? Quotation from Psalm 22. There's a trajectory of hope in Psalm 22, but this is called the cry of dereliction. This is a cry of, at least in the moment, a cry of hopelessness. It's not a hopeless cry ultimately, but in the moment, my God, why have you forsaken me? The earth is quaking. The sun will not shine. Jesus feels in himself, it seems, the consequences. I speak carefully here because I don't want to misspeak, but at the same time, and I think with our finite minds, we're on infinite kind of ground here, but there was a sense in which Jesus experienced something in that moment that reflects the experience of human beings since Genesis 3, and that is distance between him and God, the Father. I can't explain that. I don't think any of us can really. How can God the Son, perfectly God, be in some sense distance from the Father? I don't know the answer to that, but the language has got to be telling us something. The earth is quaking. The sun will not shine. Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And we know that the biblical story from Genesis 3 from Genesis 1 is, God wants to be with us. He wants to be with us. The tabernacle won't work. The temple won't work. It's not that God tried him and failed, but rather he's wanting us to see that these are mitigations. They don't work ultimately. And so what does God do? God comes to us himself in Jesus. And Jesus, in that moment, is bearing in his body, the judicial, settled opposition to all that's evil and unjust. The greatest act of evil, the most unjust act that's ever been perpetrated was perpetrated on that hill outside of Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, when the forces of evil gathered themselves together and in an unjust moment acted, manipulating the forces at their disposal, and had God killed on a cross. But somehow, in God's infinite wisdom and foreknowledge, God could use that act of evil and unjust as a tool himself to bring about reconciliation through the Son. In Galatians 3:13, there's this interesting expression. And it talks about that Jesus received in himself the curse of God, the curse of God. Let me just talk about this just for a second. I want you, maybe you'll go back and think about this more later. The curse of God. If you look at Galatians 3:13, it talks about Jesus receiving the curse of God. That's actually a quotation from a passage in Deuteronomy where someone had committed a capital crime, like they had murdered or whatever. Let's say they'd committed murder, and as a result of that, they received the death penalty. In Deuteronomy 21, that is called the curse of God. And what happened was, you would take that person who had committed a capital crime, and he was going to be put to death. They would take him, and they would kill him. He would be executed, and they would impale his body on a tree, on a pole outside of the camp. And what Paul says here is that at the cross, Jesus received in himself the curse of God. That is, Jesus experienced capital punishment because of nothing he did, but because of what we did. The judicial, settled opposition to all things evil and unjust that God would, in a capital system, in a judicial system, capital punishment on the one who had committed the crime. But only in Jesus' case, He in Himself, in God's infinite love for us, Jesus, 2 Corinthians 5:21 says it pretty clearly. Jesus, I love this verse, He who knew no sin became sin for us, that we might be made the righteousness of God in Him. What that means is, the sinless one became as if He were a sinner, so that the sinners might be as if we had no sin. The wrath of God. What is it? God's judicial settled opposition to all things evil and unjust. And here's where we got to go with the question that we've got tonight, and that is, why is God angry at sin? And I hope we've talked about that enough to at least give a kind of a provisional answer to that, but ultimately this goes to the cross. If we have a faith problem, we need to understand that the answer ultimately is that God's judicial wrath is poured out not on us, but on Jesus. And so as a result of that, we put our faith in Him. Romans 3:21 through 25 talks about faith in Jesus and Jesus becoming our propitiation, where He receives the punishment we deserved. God's wrath, it's real. I don't want to downplay it at all. Only I want you to see this trajectory in the biblical story, and that is, it ends at the cross, where you see the wrath of human beings poured out on Jesus, but as an expression ultimately of what God is doing to Jesus, to Himself, so that you and I could be declared innocent. I know you're not having a formal invitation. James, last chapter in James, talks about opportunities we all have to confess to one another. And I know that if you have some sort of sin problem in your life, pull Scott aside, pull one of the elders aside. They'd be glad to talk to you and pray for you. If there's anybody who wants to become a Christian, that invitation's always open, right? And I know that's communicated here quite often. Talk to Scott, talk to one of the elders, talk to one of the men or women here about your relationship to Jesus Christ. They would be thrilled. See the thing here, let me close with this. The thing about all this is God's not angry at you. Not angry at you. He's angry at what sin's doing to you. He's angry at what sin has done to you. But He expressed that anger, that wrath on Himself, so that you and I could be declared righteous, so that we would receive only the love of God. And that's a beautiful thing for His children. Let's pray as we close tonight. Lord, thank You so much for this good day. Thank You for the rain, and thank You for this church, Central Church. Thank You for ministers and elders and all the men and women here who are doing Your will. I pray that You'd bless them and use them to Your glory. Be with them as they, like all of us, are trying to navigate through hard times right now to figure out how it is You want us to live and be and act and lead and serve. And just pray You will continue using this good church to be a blessing to the Tuscaloosa community, and that You would honor them and use them to bring glory to Your holy name. Be with us tonight. We are so thankful that You love us, Father, and that we are recipients of that love because of what Jesus did for us at the cross. And let us live in view of that awesome, awesome thing. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Comes.
You were here singing. Appreciate the message from Chuck, and I wasn't mad at him. I just knew you do a good job. the topic, and all of these lessons throughout the series on why are going to be difficult. Next week, Mark Howell is actually going to pick up where Chuck left off somewhat and talk about why Christ had to die. And so we now know it has to do with God's anger at sin and his wrath at sin. And so now we'll see actually why the cross was a necessary part of that. And we'll look at that next week. And I'm looking forward to that. So that's next week, same time, same place. Maybe we'll get some of the bugs worked out in the system again by then. Again, thank you for being here. Do appreciate everyone's presence. I do want to throw a couple of things in the highlights, or as we close with prayer, I do want to mention a few folks in prayer. I don't have any necessary updates, but do remember those folks who have been listed and those that are going through tests and those that are dealing with things. We have extended family members of our family here who are dealing with the coronavirus at this time, and we ask that you remember them in your prayers as well. And check on folks. Again, it's good to have everyone here. Glad that you're here with us. Let's close our time together again with a prayer. Dear God, we thank you so much for your blessings. We thank you for your care. And Father, we thank you for your love that loves us so much that despite the distance that is between us because of sin, that you do what you do to bridge that gap, to bring us back to you through your Son, Jesus. Father, in our world, our broken world, there are so many that are suffering from different things. Father, we do pray for Ashley Knowles, for Alice Carson and Louis Spence, for Barb Davis, for Burton Barbara English, for Betty Bradford, for B.J. Harris, for Bill Rose, and Chris Clark, Annette Haynes, David Wilson, George Fowler, Glenda Madison, Glenn Griffin, Hazel Lee, Jewel White, Joe Larry Underwood, Leon Helen Bad, Mary Nealings and Billy Leopard, Nancy White, Ron Holmes and Sam Merriweather, Shirley Edward, Ted Cheney, Terry Beck, Wayne and Sandy Dale. Father, there's so many others, many family members, and many friends that we know of, that we're not mentioning our prayer. Father, you know their needs, you know those who are taking care of them. Father, be with them and take care of them. Be with us as we are here this evening. Be with us as we separate and go home, go to our places as we travel. Father, be with each and every one of us. Help us be able to return again to be with you and worship you. Father, we thank you for those that are worshiping with us and joining us as we are having to do things online during this time of life. Father, we appreciate the presence, and we hope that these messages that we are sharing will help each and every one of us grow closer and closer to you. This is in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.